Okay, today we're going to look at Module 2, Lesson 10, the distributive property and the product of decimals. Product means to multiply. I know you all know how to do long multiplication. I know you all know how to multiply decimals. So today's lesson will hopefully either be a good review for good practice, or maybe it'll even seem very simple. It'll be different for everybody. But the purpose of today's lesson, and I know some of you might want to say, why do we have to do so many steps, or why are we doing it this way? Remember, a lot of time with the modules, we start off easy, using information that we know to review a process. And then eventually we're going to take this process and apply it in a new way. So today we're going to look at a new way to multiply decimals so that you understand the distributive property. And then to give you a little hint, a little sneak peek, when we get into algebra, we're going to use this distributive property in algebra. But right now we're just going to practice the distributive property using multiplication of decimals. Okay, so for part of you do now, I asked you to multiply these two numbers together. So how many of you put this factor on top? And how many of you put the 200 factor on top? So how many of you did it the first way? Raise your hand. How many of you did it the second way? Raise your hand. Okay. Multiplication is commutative, so both ways are correct. Okay? It doesn't matter. Do I have to line up decimals when I'm multiplying? No. No, it's not. Please listen. Lining up the decimals is only important when you're adding and subtracting. So it's okay that this decimal is here, and when it's a whole number, you know your decimal's at the end. And we don't have to write it when our decimal's at the end. So here, either way of setting it up is correct, and you do not have to line up the decimals. Now, personally, I think it's easier to set it up the first way, because when I'm multiplying by 200, I just can bring down my 0 and my 0. Instead of having a whole row of zeros and a second row of zeros, if I'm multiplying by 200, I know I have to have two zeros. So 2 times 6 is 2, carry the 1, 5, 6. And now what about my decimal? What's the rule for my decimal? Bring it down. I'm sorry, say that again. Somebody's calling out and I couldn't hear you. Alright, so there's one digit after the decimal here. There are no digits after the decimal here. So there's a total of one digit after the decimal. So my decimal is always at my end, but I have to move it over 1. So then I'm going to rewrite my answer so that there's no confusion with my arrows and my decimals. And that's your answer. Let's take a look at the second one. I personally think that it's easier to put the factor with the zeros as the second factor. Remember, you can line them up to the right. We do not have to line up the decimals. So whenever I'm multiplying by 100, I would add 2 zeros to the number. So 5 times 2 is 10. 5 times 1 is 5, plus 1 is 6. 5 times 2 is 10, 11. But now here I have 2 digits after the decimal. Here I have 0 digits after the decimal. So now I have to move my decimal in my product 2 places. So then I rewrite my answer so that I can read it and circle it. Now sometimes multiplying with the decimal can be a little confusing. Let's take a look at this example, okay? So if we were working to find the area of a patio, a lot of times backyards, closets, bedrooms, whatever we're working on area, aren't always nice even numbers. It's not always a 10 by 10 room. You might have decimals. So if we wanted to find the area of a patio that was 500 times 22.12, we would just multiply the length times the width, right? But mentally that could be a little difficult to do. So we're going to use the distributive property to help us. Why don't we break down that 22.12 into 22 and 0.12 and multiply the 500 by each. So we'll distribute. So redraw the picture in your notes like you see on the board. We cut this into two pieces. So this piece is 22 and the top piece is 0.12. You're drawing this in your notes. They gave you the box, but now you're going to separate it. Just separate the box that they gave you into two pieces. So now let's distribute that 500 to both pieces. So here we have 500 times 22. Here we have 500 times 0.12. I know this seems like more steps at this point, but again, the purpose of this is to practice the distributive property so that we see what it means. So we can do 22 times 500 and 1200 times 500. Again, multiplication is commutative, so you can write it either way. I think it's easy to put the zeros on the bottom so we don't have to add all those rows of zero. 5 times 2 is 10 and 11. We have to move the decimal 2 places here. So now I'm going to take my two products, 11,060, and add the two areas together. And I get the same answer that I did when I did my long multiplication. But sometimes it's easier to multiply by the whole number than multiply by the decimal, and then find the sum of the two. Some of you might find the other method easier, but again, the purpose of this is to practice the distributive property so that we understand it when we get to algebra. And what I should have done when I wrote my answer, I forgot to label it feet squared because it's area. And you know how to do that. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording now because you're going to work at stations. So if you're watching this at home, you can print out the sample problems from the blog and then check the answers by printing out the class notes, but the answers are on the slides.